I'm Dan Zielinski of the Baseball Prospect Journal, joined by Colin Cannonberg of StatSwipe. Today's episode is going to be a little different. It's going to be kind of a mixture of my podcast that I do on Baseball Prospect Journal, as well as the 3 and 2 What's He Gonna Do podcast that we do each and every week. It's going to be a draft-heavy podcast talking about all the latest guys and all the latest news surrounding the draft, which begins on Monday. So, Colin, looking forward to talking some draft with you.
Yeah, same here. It's exciting. It's less than a week away.
Well, as we've talked about in the past and as we've talked off air, it's hard to believe the draft has already kind of come, and it's less than a week away, 5 days out at the timing of this recording. And yeah, it's just come up quick and hard to believe it's already almost June.
I know. It just seems like baseball makes the year go faster. Remember when you just look forward until pitchers and catchers are reporting, and then soon after that it seems like it's opening day?
I know, and now, like I said, yeah, it's June. We're almost 2 months through the baseball season, and yeah, it's just like, even though the baseball season's 162 games, colleges play over 30 games in a season, it just seems like it flies by.
Right. I feel like the year would be near 600 days long if we didn't have baseball.
Yeah, it's a great sport, but yeah. Kind of.
Yeah.
What do you think about the draft? What do you think about the draft?
Before we start, I just want to say, what did you think of that, the Brewers against the Twins, the series I meant?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe Minnesota is the best team, or record-wise. I don't know if they still are, but we're going into that series the best team in baseball. They've got some really good players, but a lot of me wants to say that they're just doing that well because that division is just so bad.
Yeah, no, they're just 37 and 17. You know, I thought the Twins would be decent, but wow, they're just good.
But it's not like they've got crazy talent. Sure, they've got some solid pieces. Nelson Cruz, Jose Barrios is a good young arm, but it's not like they're a team like the Phillies or the Yankees that you go up and down their lineup and pitching staff and it's just name after name, all-star after all-star either.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. I feel they have a lot of guys overperforming or I guess not overperforming, just performing how they're expected to perform. That, they got a really good Kepler, and they got, Buxton is starting to hit now, and I think finally their guys are doing what they wanted them to do.
Yeah, I don't know if it's sustainable. I mean, I'd like to see them make the playoffs. I always like the smaller markets making it, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see if they're able to carry it over the 162 game schedule. There's been teams in the past who have always gotten off to these big starts, teams with kind of younger, inexperienced talent, and then they kind of fade down the stretch. But the Indians just don't look that good, especially their offense. Their just lineup is not very good after Lindor and maybe a couple other guys. But I don't know. It's such an easy division that they'd really have to screw it up to not win that division, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what happens when Cleveland decides to take the offseason off. So, yeah, good for the Twins. I'd like to see them in the playoffs.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, well, now that we got Brewer talk out of the way, the draft. So I was looking the other day at Adley Rutschman. Is that how you say his last name?
Rutschman. Yeah, Rutschman. Yeah.
That guy is just raking in college this year. He's, what were his stats? He was putting up Goliath numbers here, hitting .419 with 17 home runs on the year, has an on base of .580.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty safe to say he should be the number one pick in baseball.
Oh, I think he will be. I don't think there's always talk. Will the team with the number one pick go in a different direction? But I think with the Orioles and just the lack of talent they have in their farm system, they have to take the guy who's the best available player, and that's Adley Rutschman, catcher from Oregon State. This guy's a switch hitter, hits for power, hits for average, great behind the plate, really good defensively as well. He's got an above average arm. He's not maybe the most athletic guy, but he gets the job done in terms of that aspect behind the plate and really just kind of an all around great player. I know there's some people who think he might be the best player draft prospect since Bryce Harper in, what was that, 2010, I believe. So, I mean, he's got some pedigree and just history behind him with his track record at Oregon State. So we'll see if he is the first pick, but I think there's probably a 99.9999% chance that he's the number one guy. So
Right, and I think, this might be an unsophisticated look at it just based on his colors being orange and black now. It only makes sense that he sticks in those colors with Baltimore.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a guy who's going to move through a system quickly too, and I don't know if people remember the guy Joey Bart, Georgia Tech. Last year was first round pick highly by the San Francisco Giants, and everyone raved about him, but he's even better than Joey Bart just in terms of overall skill and probably even at the plate, especially his ability to hit and his defense too it's really kind of advanced defensively, his defense, which you don't always see with catchers coming out of the draft.
Now, I don't know if you talked with him about this during, I guess. Did you interviewed him, right? Or
No, I didn't interview him. He's like one of the top guys, only one of the few top guys that I didn't talk to. Him and Bobby Witt, I didn't. Still maybe Bobby Witt, we'll see, but yeah, not Adley.
Okay. Because it'd be interesting to know. He really was below average, or I guess average for a college catcher in 2017. He only hit 234, had 2 home runs, 33 RBIs.
Yeah.
Nothing too special. But then in 2018, there he hit 408 with 9 dingers. He just, with a 505 on base, he seemed to put it together in 2018, and then just even improved upon that this year.
Yeah. He did have some interest coming out of high school in terms of the draft and stuff like that, but had a strong commitment to Oregon State. Also, maybe wasn't going to be selected as high just in terms of bonus pool money. But you see that a lot with freshmen too. A lot of guys struggle a little bit just to kind of get used to the speed of the game in terms of the pitching and just adjust to just better pitching in general in terms of secondary pitches. And also pitchers are better at changing speeds and keeping hitters off balance more than at the high school level. But also a guy coming in as a catcher too, it's always even more of a transition just because you have to, even though a lot of coaches call pitches, you still kind of have to be familiar with the pitching staff. Also have to work a lot on your defense too behind the plate. So just a lot more goes into being a catcher, especially your freshman year when you're trying to adjust to college baseball.
And I guess it's good that he showed how much he can adjust. What sticks out too is he had 27 walks in about the same amount of games started, and jumped that up to 53 in 2018, and this year took 73 walks.
Yeah.
With less strikeouts than he's ever had too. There are only 37 strikeouts. So with that kind of power, with that plate discipline as well, he sure is looking good for the majors someday.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think he's a guy that's going to move through a system quick. Will the Orioles move him quickly? It's kind of maybe to be seen, just because why move a guy through and have him in the majors by 2021 when you're probably still not going to be competitive and using some of that service time? But he's going to be a stud, I think, and I don't think there's really any questions, or I think it'd be a big surprise if this guy isn't at least a starting major league catcher. Now, is he going to be a superstar? He has the potential to be that, but I think he's at least a guy who you can count on within the next 3-4 years to be in the major leagues and being a starting catcher.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be fun to see him grow into that role.
Yeah.
Going on, to the second best, and again, if the Orioles don't take Adley, they'd be taking Bobby Witt Jr., who I've seen headlines saying he might be the best shortstop in the draft since A-Rod. Pretty high praise for that guy. What do you see with him?
Yeah, he's probably the second best in terms of in this year's draft prospect. I know the Orioles, maybe if they don't take Adley, would take him, or maybe even Andrew Vaughn, maybe J.J. Bleday from Vanderbilt. But Bobby Witt specifically, he's a guy who kind of has a chance to be a five-tool shortstop. He hits for average. He's got a good feel for the strike zone at the plate. Is able to hit gap to gap. Has good ability in terms of just making contact, hitting for average. And then he's also got above average speed. Arm strength is above average as well. And just a solid fielder at shortstop. He's a guy who's an Oklahoma commit. Probably a lot of that has to do because his dad went to Oklahoma, if I had to guess, just growing up around that program. His dad is Bobby Witt, who's a former major leaguer. And so he's got the background and pedigree in terms of that aspect of being the son of a former major league guy. Is he the second best shortstop than A-Rod? I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to compare because especially these guys are going to be judged on what they do in the major leagues. And if A-Rod didn't do anything in the major leagues, maybe people aren't praising him as much. But again, I think he's a five-tool guy, and I think the Royals are going to be thrilled if he's on the board. Throughout the spring, I've had the Orioles taking Adley Rutschman, then the Royals taking Bobby Witt Jr., and those two teams and those two guys seem just like locks for the top two picks, and then it gets a little interesting after that. But yeah, I think Bobby Witt Jr. has a chance to be a real superstar in the league someday.
Yeah, and he at perfect game he has like a 6.40 60-yard dash. Consistently puts exit velocities up over 100 is what it says, and he has some good bat speed by what it looks. Something that I think it would fit a Royals system. He seems like an athletic, quick shortstop, and yeah, I think he would fit that Royals team perfectly.
And I know I've had some people say, why would the Royals take a shortstop? They already have Alberto Mondesi at shortstop, and he looks like he's going to be the real deal guy that's going to play that position for at least 10 years. But with the baseball draft, and especially in the early rounds, and when you're a team selecting this high, you always take the best player available, or the best player, I guess, on your board that you have. And so position-wise, it really doesn't matter, especially in this instance where he's a shortstop and he's capable and has the skills to move over to third base, second base. You probably could even stick him in the outfield if you had to. But it would be different with, like, say, Andrew Vaughn, the Cal first baseman. He's maybe the best hitter in this year's draft class, but the reason he's not maybe going to go till the Tigers at pick number 5 is because he's a first baseman. So that maybe is a little bit reason why a team wouldn't pick a guy, even though he might be better than maybe someone else, is just because of versatility and potential and just all-around skills. So in the first and maybe even top 10 rounds, teams always are usually picking best player available most instances, and that's kind of what you have to do if you want to have success in terms of drafting talent.
Right, I agree, and it that's where it differs from the NFL draft.
Yeah.
In a way where it's more position based than the NFL. Yeah, baseball. I think these ball players, especially if you get a good athlete, one of those middle infielders, you see them transition all over. Trey Turner was playing the outfield for the Nats for how long?
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that teams have the ability to do, and these athletes are a lot more equipped to adapt to a new position.
Yeah, and I mean, this draft especially is kind of weak with pitching and high-end pitching, especially college pitching. So you're going to see a lot of position players going early, and yeah, it's just going to be kind of one of those drafts where you see a lot of college guys and a lot of position players going early. I don't think you'll see a pitcher go until number 7 at Cincinnati with Nick Lodelo, the left-handed pitcher from TCU. So it's after the first two picks, it's just kind of a matter of who goes where because I think for the most part it's going to be position players in the top 6, and that's going to be one of the latest times a pitcher has ever gone if Nick Lodelo or any pitcher I guess goes number 7. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this first round plays out because there isn't. It's very rare that you don't have a guy who's a pitcher in the mix to be a top 3 pick. So just kind of adds, I guess, a little
Yeah,
bit more intrigue to the draft.
I think the fact that pitchers they will get injured. That's just what pitchers do is get injured.
Yeah.
Might be a cause for concern. Yes, I feel there's a lot more risk in pitchers being a bust. I don't know. I mean, obviously there's busts everywhere. One of these 5 guys are probably going to bust. So, but it seems like pitchers especially, it's always less likely in my mind that they're going to actually turn out.
Yeah, exactly. And you're one of those guys who always thinks to pick position players early and kind of fill in with
Hmm.
free agency or trade with pitchers later, I guess, in terms of
Yeah,
organizational.
definitely the way. Not, I mean, coming from my personal GM experience of fantasy baseball, I always draft my position players first, get a loaded lineup there, and then start pitching. And of course, my first pitcher taken this year was Luis Castillo. Well, looks like he's turning out and has a 13th round pick. So
Yeah.
just my experience, and yeah, I think that's kind of what it looks like in what these teams are doing in the majors.
Yeah.
Going after some better opportunity in position players.
Exactly.
Now, 2 teams that I'm interested in looking at, especially, is the Chicago White Sox at 3 and the Padres at 6.
Mm-hmm.
2 teams that already have some of the top farm systems in baseball coming into this year, and both teams, more so the Padres, who are looking to compete now in the next year, or this year and next year for sure, and I think the White Sox will be there next year. This draft almost to me seems like they could really put a dagger in things if they can convert on their first round picks here.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see kind of what direction, especially the White Sox, go because obviously they're number 3 and they're going to have their pick of who they want after Adley Rutschman and Bobby Witt Jr. And it's kind of weird because usually in the past they'd prefer that college hitter and just kind of that safer option, someone who's going to move through a system quicker. But it seems like they're kind of leaning towards selecting a guy like C.J. Abrams, a prep shortstop from Georgia, Alabama commit, and he's a guy who's got it just elite speed, really athletic guy, and not necessarily maybe the White Sox typical demographic with drafting early. They usually like to get a college arm or kind of a college position player. Lately, a college position player, and that's why I thought early on this year, Andrew Vaughn, the shortstop, the first baseman from Cal, kind of would be the ideal guy for them. But I think him being a first baseman is kind of maybe made him a little bit less desirable, even though I think he could be in the major leagues hitting by next September. I think just that lack of defensive versatility and maybe skills in general kind of hurts him. But it looks like they might go C.J. Abrams, which would be a surprise. And then if the draft kind of plays out how I think it will with J.J. Bleday, outfielder from Vanderbilt, going to the Marlins, and then Andrew Vaughn going to the Tigers. The Padres, I have them as of now selecting Riley Green, a prep outfielder from Florida, which also is kind of against their typical trend. Usually they like to take the top left-handed prep pitching prospect, and now in this year's draft, with that not being a strong point, really prep pitching as a whole and pitching, like I mentioned earlier, not as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
with being a major weakness kind of in this draft. I have them going the prep hitter route and not. I don't. They're a tough team to pinpoint just because that's so against their normal trend. But I guess they could go Nick Lodelo, the left-hander from TCU, but he doesn't have major upside. He's more of a middle of the rotation arm. They could go like a guy like Jackson Rutledge, a right-hander, JUCO guy who's got more upside, also some risk. So it's just the guys available for them is probably not going to be what they usually select. Now, it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be interesting to see, do they try to get a guy with lower ceiling that's going to move quicker through the farm system, or do they take just best player available? And I think both teams in both instances will just take best player available.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do. I do always like how San Diego can develop their prospects, and always kind of hope for them to turn out after it seems Austin Hedges not quite there, Hunter Renfroe has been
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, I'll be curious to see what they do now in this draft.
I always think it's best to just take the best player available, regardless of maybe. I can see maybe picking a certain demographic, but usually best player available in the top 10 is the best way to go, especially if that's position player, just because the less risk involved. Really, when you select a position player, you're just hoping the guy doesn't get a serious injury, which is less common than a pitcher, and that he develops, and so less risk involved. So yeah, it should be interesting.
Yeah. Now, moving on to the Brewers, you have them taking Tyler Callahan out of Providence High School in Florida. Tell me a little bit about him.
Yeah, he's a prep guy. He played shortstop for his high school team. Probably profiles better as a third baseman. But when I talked to him just a week, I think it was ago, maybe two, he said a third of the teams are more along the lines of, we know you're going to hit, and that's kind of your top trait. We'll figure out the position later. Another group of teams see him being a guy that's third baseman, shortstop, second base, maybe even left field. And then there's two teams, he said, that view him maybe more as an offensive-minded catcher, which is kind of the way I'm leaning towards with him. But I think, anyway, a team is drafting him because of his bat. He's one of the top prep hitters in this year's draft class. A little bit older for his age, going to be almost 19 years old right after the draft. But he's a guy who just hits, and he has power, hits for average, and he's a guy that will be drafted because of his hitting ability. And I think most teams are going to figure out the position later, but it most likely will be at third base.
Yeah, I mean, I believe a big bat is the way to go there, and you can see with the Brewers how they'd want to make him, I guess, an offensive-minded catcher. Having a preview, or I guess what could be a preview of that with Grandal this year. First time since one of those Lucroy seasons that the Brewers have had a big-time offensive catcher, and Nottingham is not becoming that at all. So.
Yeah, it's always riskier with prep players and them usually as catchers, just because the defensive part and understanding how to call a game with pitches and developing that relationship with the pitching staff always takes extra time. But if you have the mindset if he's going to be an offensive-minded catcher, maybe those traits aren't that necessary in terms of pitch framing, blocking. Obviously, you want him to do it at a decent job, and he's played catcher a little bit throughout his high school career, played it 5 or 6 times this high school season as a senior. He also was Team USA's backup catcher, more of kind of an emergency guy. They did that because then they could take another pitcher with, and he never played besides just in kind of practices and stuff like that. But I think it adds to kind of the intrigue and ceiling of him if he is an offensive-minded catcher. I just think there's more value with him, but I still think either way he's one of the best hitters regardless of what position he's at in terms of the prep class.
Right. Yeah. Moving on, one of the guys who, right when you kind of told me about him and I looked him up, who I think has one of the highest ceilings in the draft, and tell me if I'm wrong, but Daniel Espino, you have going in the later first round, 25th to the Dodgers. He's someone who just really looks like he could have a high ceiling. You say he occasionally reaches triple digits, like he can blow people away.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of, to me, looks like a Luis Severino.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy who maybe 5 years ago would be a top 5 pick in the draft, but the recent track record with hard throwing prep right-handed pitchers is not good. Just look back at anyone really. Riley Pine is the biggest example of that. He was I think third or fourth overall pick by the Rockies a few years back. Similar kind of some effort to his delivery, throws that big time fastball. He hasn't developed as the Rockies or anyone really thought he would. Now, Daniel Espino has advanced secondary pitches, so that's something that's a positive for him. But teams are kind of concerned about maybe some effort in his delivery and the arm angle, kind of reaching back maybe farther than they would like. Just think he might be more of a reliever down the line. And I know there's teams who aren't going to draft him regardless, and then there's teams that are also high on him. So he's kind of a big wild card because there could be a team in the top 20 picks that really loves him and will draft him. I don't think that'll be the case. I think he'll be more of the 20 to 30, 35 range. But, yeah, you said it, kind of good size, good kind of just makeup and skills. And, yeah, he's just a wild card because of those factors and the previous history with hard-throwing right-handed pitchers not in his favor.
Yeah. Another pitcher who I was looking at is Alek Manoah out of West Virginia.
Yeah.
Big guy. He looks built. Looks like someone who will hold up. And he's done well for West Virginia so far. What do you think of him going number 11 to Toronto?
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. Like I said, I think he could go as high as 6 to the Padres, but I don't see him getting past Toronto at 11. And there's some other teams in the middle of that range that could draft him. But he was a guy coming into the year that was considered maybe a first-round pick. He would have to have a good season, obviously, to get into the first round. But he really had a good year, really just dominated opposing teams and has moved up draft boards. Part of that is because there's really not a lot of good college pitching, so that's helped his case. But big-time fastball that sits mid to upper 90s, 94, 97. Also has a really good slider that keeps hitters kind of off balance and he uses as his out pitch. Changeup needs some work, obviously. That's usually the case when you have a kind of hard-throwing guy, but great size, like you mentioned, 6'6", 260. And he's a guy who, although might be kind of middle of the rotation type, he's a guy that has shown an ability to maintain his velocity late into games this year. And I think even though his track record might not be kind of what some of these other guys are, I think he has a chance just to stick in a rotation and kind of has that higher floor than maybe some other guys do. So.
Right. Yeah, I always wonder, these teams go in and draft some of these pitchers, and I assume they always look at these pitchers to be top of the rotation guys, and it's after they flame out as a starter that they become a reliever. I wonder if they would have a crystal ball and see if these pitchers can become one of those elite relievers. If they'd even prefer that, if they knew they could get an elite reliever for years to come, if that's what they do, if they take some guys, maybe a bit further up the draft, knowing that, as opposed to trying them as a starter and having a below-average starter.
I think that's becoming more kind of intriguing because of the success guys like Josh Hader have had. I think that's definitely possible. And obviously with the prep guys, you probably hope to see more growth and ceiling in terms of them just because they're not developed as much. So they still have a lot of room to mature and grow. Whereas the college guys, you really kind of have seen them the last 3, 4 years and kind of know what to expect at this point. There's not that much room, maybe typically, for them to grow. Obviously, there's exceptions to that. But yeah, I mean, I think in today's game, there's more teams looking as dominant relievers. I wrote a story recently on Matt Cronin. He's a relief pitcher closer for Arkansas, and he's a two-pitch pitcher, but a dominant guy who is going to be probably the first reliever selected, probably second round. But definitely, I think teams are looking at pitchers more as just pitchers instead of starter reliever and how much value they have in whatever role they're pitching at.
Yeah. So who in this draft would you say has, increased their draft stock the most? Who's been going up the board quick?
There's a lot of guys. J.J. Bleday, the Vanderbilt outfielder, he was a guy, probably maybe a first-round pick, but he's now really pushed himself into top 5 consideration, probably to the Marlins at 4. Hunter Bishop, the outfielder from Arizona State, was considered probably a top 5 round guy. He's going to be a top 10 pick now. Just really showed improvement with his power, hitting in general. You've had some of those college pitchers have kind of flipped spots, but that's, I think, more due to the fact that there's just not, like I said before, that great depth at that position. So guys like Jackson Rutledge, junior college guy, has moved up higher into the first round than many would have thought. If you kind of go down maybe later into the first round, Keani Cavaco, he's a third baseman, prep guy from California. He was really nowhere on anyone's radars last year at this time, and really good fall. Kind of started to receive some interest at that point, and now he's a guy that will probably be a first-round pick. Seth Johnson, right-handed pitcher from Campbell University. He's a guy who was a shortstop at the junior college level last year and was pretty much terrible as a hitter. And Campbell developed him into a pitcher, and he's a guy who's going to be, if not a first-round pick, right outside the first round. And Cody Hose, he's a third baseman from Tulane, showed really good power this spring, hit over 20 home runs after really not having much power and just kind of struggling the last 2 years. So those are just some guys who have kind of come out of, whether that's being considered top 5 round or even nowhere, to be considered first-round picks.
Right. Now, do you think some of those, like Cody Host, those guys who break out for 1 year, it seems kind of risky.
Oh, it definitely is. And that's why you really have to trust your area scouts and believe that what they did this year can carry over into pro ball. And that's why they're going to be more later first-round picks, because there's a lot of risk involved. But there's also some great, in terms of ceiling, higher ceiling, because they're still kind of raw and there's still stuff to be showed. So the reward is maybe better than what they've shown in the past. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more risk, and you've seen that in previous years. One guy who sticks out to me is Eric Arnett, a pitcher the Brewers selected early on in the first round years back, maybe 7 years ago or something like that now, if not longer. I think maybe 2008, so over 10 years ago. But regardless, he was a guy who really did nothing his first 2 years at Indiana as a pitcher, had just a really, really good junior year, and even was probably pitched way too much by their coach. He had games where he's throwing 130 pitches, stuff like that. But he had that 1 year. The Brewers thought it was legit and drafted him, and he was a complete bust from pretty much day one. So that's just kind of part of the risk of the MLB draft. You don't know once you get these guys what they're going to do, and sometimes you find that out quicker than others. But
yeah, no, that's true. So I guess anybody else you think is more of a steal here? Anyone else you want to talk about?
There's a lot of guys. I'm curious to see kind of this year's draft. While there's some like predictable guys are probably gonna go where, there's just a lot of like unknown, and I don't know if that's because the Arizona Diamondbacks have a signing bonus pool amount of over $16 million. A lot of picks early on in this year's draft, so it's gonna be interesting and fascinating to watch how they kind of control the draft because they're going to control the draft with that signing bonus pool, having the largest signing pool bonus amount and a lot of early round picks. I think 7 in the first 100, I believe. So they're just really going to control the draft. And if you start to see guys falling, you probably know that they're going to draft them. And if the Diamondbacks don't draft them, they're probably not going to go draft. They're probably going to go undrafted at that point, just because they can pay anyone whatever they want, pretty much.
True. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's all I've got for draft stuff.
Cool. Well, it'll be interesting to see how the draft plays out. Like I said, less than a week away. By the time we're recording this podcast next week, the draft will be completed by then, and we can give our thoughts on how we thought the Brewers and any other teams did. So thank you again for listening to this edition of the 3 and 2 What's He Gonna Do podcast. I'm Dan Zielinski of the Baseball Prospect Journal, thirdmanin.com. Joined as always by Colin Cannonberg of statswipe.com. We'll be back next week to recap the draft and talk about all the latest news in baseball. Thank you for listening.